And my hope is that in the same way you would learn Greek to understand physics, you would learn Latin to understand law. You would learn the indigenous language, or whatever space you're in, to understand sustainability. And it would afford practitioners the living wage jobs, the agency and executive directing decision making and recalibrating what others fucked up.
Welcome back to Radical Narrative. I am your host, Mylan Thesis. Very awesome episode coming to you today. I'm sitting down with Kamuela Enos from Waianae, Hawaii. He'll position himself in this podcast to give you specifics about where he's from and what he does. But this episode was really insightful for me. I had to actually sit and reflect multiple times to catch on to what he was saying. And this was the second time I got to sit down with Kamuela Enos and have a conversation about the work he does. And I first met him when I was in Hawaii, out at Ma'o Farms. He's now in a formal position as the director of the Office of Indigenous Innovation for the University of Hawaii. So listen in as we have a conversation about Hawaiian strengths and history, Kamehameha's badassery, indigenous data scientists, and ultimately the need to create infrastructure and economic engines for our people to reclaim the lives we want. It was an amazing conversation. I'm still reflecting on it. I really hope you enjoy it. So stay tuned and listen in. Yeah, and I'll let you introduce yourself in your own way, however you feel comfortable introducing yourself.
Aloha mai, ovo o Kamuela Joseph Nui Enos. No makaha mai au o kaala ku'u mauna o honua ku'u kahawai o makua ku'u kahawai, kakai, kalamai. Kohana Enos, kohana Kahana Enos, mai Hawaii, ame mai Hawaii nui, ame mai Maui, mai. So hello, mai. My name is Kamuela Joseph Nui Enos, Kanaka. One of the many genealogies that flow through my veins comes from Hawaii, but many other places. Ka'ala is my mountain that raised me. Honua is the stream that emanated from that mountain that gave me water, and Makua is the ocean that I grew up in and out of, and these are all in the moku of Waianae, on the island of Oahu, and my community is predominantly Native Hawaiian on the island of Oahu.
Yeah, and Waianae is unique. Can you explain what's unique about Waianae on the island of Oahu?
The Hawaiians on Waianae. Not a lot of them are genealogically from Waianae. Waianae is where they shunted us, but the mountains and the land received us and allowed us to reclaim who we were very graciously. And I'm a child of activists. So my father is Eric Enos and my mother is Rochelle Nui. And they're both Native Hawaiians, and they're both active in our community. My father was a group of his peers reclaimed our agricultural lands in the back of the valley in the late 70s.
Yeah, the late 70s was unique in Hawaii, obviously, like the Hawaiian Renaissance. But can you give context to why that was such a unique time for your family and your land?
And many of them had been forced to unlearn who they were. But the 60s was a great time of relearning. So they took it upon themselves to join in a collective awakening to relearn who we were. And they brought water back down to our traditional water, our agrarian systems, ways that we grew food, lo'ikalo, and did it not just as an act of resistance, but as an act of regeneration, of restoration. And from that space, evolved practice that we are all trying to work towards now. People I work closely with, restoring our practices in ways that allow us agency in contemporary times, and opportunities to co-learn together, but owning our IP, owning our agency, owning and shooting for executive decision making again in our own homeland.
Yeah. And that's how I came to met you, was seeing your projects out there and your paradigm in terms of how you're thinking about the land, and ultimately delivering very unique results that I haven't really noticed in much other sort of projects. I mean, there's tons of projects in indigenous countries out there, but yours was really unique, and I want to talk about that a little bit later. But and I know you gave a lot of context about who you are and where you come from, but how do you choose to position yourself?
And I'm the eldest of 4 boys, and of cis males who identify Kane. We don't have any Mahu or Wahine in our family.
So yeah, Kane meaning man, Wahine meaning woman, and Mahu meaning two-spirit. Two-spirit being how my indigenous people refer to Mahu, which would be two-spirited people. But you're also a father, you're also the oldest brother, and that shows up in how you like to explain things. I really like that. So yeah, is there anything that you want to say about that?
Being the eldest child and a father that has 0 work-life boundaries, I jokingly say that I have 47 years of applied experience in direct community engagement. And I think that is a real important to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And I like how you acknowledge that. I like how you say you have this experience, not only like in terms of the work you're doing, what we will talk about, but also being a community member, being a big brother, being a father now, and how this work basically is tied to who you are and what you're doing in terms of how you live your life. And I like that too, because much of my work is tied directly to my life and to my experience of being a father now, being a partner, and the projects I'm trying to start. But we had a conversation before where you highlighted it even earlier, where you said specifically intellectual property and executive decision-making power. But you also talk about agency. How would you explain agency?
My ancestors and my grandparents, through them, were Hawaiians who always exhibited agency. My mother's grandfather was Native Hawaiian, worked in the government, so he was actually one of the few early Hawaiians to have a graduate degree that we know of. And my father's grandfather, my father's father, and my father's mother, my paternal grandparents, were both Native Hawaiians, blue-collar workers. My grandfather, Joe, was a machinist in Pearl Harbor and fought in World War II. And my grandmother, Carol, was a maid in Waikiki. But as blue-collar workers, they had the foresight to buy land. And because they bought land and they sacrificed, because of those sacrifices, my father could have the ability to create economic development nonprofits and not have to be subjected to the grinding poverty that we saw around us. So I acknowledge that their sacrifices, and the idea not of sacrifice, I think that's a Western concept. I think it's more of an understanding of continuity and what you're providing to people to come after you so they can, at the very least, be as excellent as you. Their work, I carry the weight of continuing. In Hawaii, we call it kauma, the burden of making sure that, the joyful burden of making sure that I follow in their steps and provide as much as they've provided for.
Yeah, that's an amazing positionality. Like in terms of moving forward in this conversation, it really highlights who you are, where you come from, and ultimately the relationship to the work that you do. So
that is kind of my introduction of my peoples and my genealogy and my land, and that informs my practice, which I think we can talk about through conversations, because I don't know who I am. Not like I'm lost, but yeah. I guess a better way to put it is we're occupying some really liminal spaces right now, where the people who are really certain on who they are probably the first people that's going to catch the hardest cracks. As much as we need to be understanding what we're becoming, we need to be clear who we were. and what we carry, what our wayfinding as people that had to navigate a lot, to acknowledge when you're traveling to an open ocean you've not traveled through before. And what are the skills you need to wayfind in that context, and what you carry with you, and what you have to kind of understand the relationship. So hopefully that's an introduction that serves. And I'm really appreciative of this conversation. I'm really appreciative to be here.
Yeah, that's amazing. Even just how you even highlighted the fact that Indigenous people, we have these positionalities. We have, this relationship to our land and our ancestors. And because of that, colonialism's not over. Like climate change is ongoing. And because we have these relationships, potentially there's a chance that we could become victims. And we'll talk about that later. But yeah. Yeah, that's an amazing introduction, and it was all in there, like place and family and lineage and heritage, and then like for us in this podcast, really what we're doing is sharing knowledge with people, because everybody, like I like how you positioned wayfinding and finding a way to move forward, and with an agency, like having the agency to decide. Because for me, it's like I always have this saying now, and I find myself saying it more and more, where we're navigating a colonial world and it's chaotic. Like we're navigating chaos, and it was interesting for you to position the reality that for the world we're living in, it's often going to be the Indigenous people that may be pushed on the side, or maybe oppressed. And I guess to position this conversation, when I first met you, you were working out at Ma'o Farms, and I know you're not there now, but you're just dropping this knowledge in terms of like economic philosophy and social sustainability and working for young people, and everything was like syncing together in terms of your discourse, and that just stood out to me because you were invested in projects, and you're coming from a paradigm that I saw was delivering results. And that always stuck with me. Like I always remember, Kamu was there, he was talking, and this is what he was saying. And I don't remember the specific words, but I felt what you were saying was like, it stuck with me. And I was like, that guy knows what he's talking about, and he's wayfinding. And for me, like what stood out the most was literally the results of your projects and what you're doing. So I guess I'll ask that as a question: is where are you now? What type of work are you doing? And what do you bring to the work that you're doing in terms of your own philosophy? And I guess continuing off your introduction there.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I really appreciate that there was resonance. When we would have people come to Ma'o, it was something that really meant a lot to me, that I honestly felt if what we were doing is successful only in our community, then we're abject failures. On the other hand, this isn't a franchise where you could just say, well, all you got to do is get kids to go to college and start a farm, and boom, you've solved hundreds of years of colonial. Yeah. It's that easy. And because then you'll be blowing smoke up people's ass. And like, what the hell did they sell? So it was always about the hope was in these conversations we would have when people would visit, it's not replication.
Yeah. And you highlight how it's resonance, right? And it did resonate with me because your project was yielding results. And just to sum up, Ma'o Farms it's a land-based project where you literally grow food, and you have children working there, and they're not only eating and growing the food, but they're also going to college as a result of that project and coming back and working for the land-based project. I summed it up very briefly. Like you could Google it. We'll put it in the show notes so you could see it. Maybe even visit there one day after the pandemic, because they do tours also. But yeah, it was a cool project to see. And I know you're not there right now. And can you explain what you're doing now?
So I am currently the director of a brand new office that was created. It's called Office of Indigenous Innovation. And I'm working now out of the research arm of the University of Hawaii. So I'm in the office of the Vice President for Research and Innovation for UH system.
Yeah, so it's like a new flow for you. It's like a new space you're in, going from like literally growing food out on the land to the office.
If you want to be as radically different workspace. we're going to Ma'o, like
yeah. Well, it's a new office, right? It's a new office. So can you explain to me and our listeners what this office is, because it is pretty unique.
So this office this is the only office of its kind in what we would consider America. We're situated within the Office of Research, and I'm right next to the vice president. I'm in the executive arm of the university.
Yeah, you're in there. You're like literally in a research wing and arm of a university, right next to the office of the vice president, right?
What am I doing here? I ask myself quite often, but the genealogy of it is clear. The genealogy of this office is based out of the university. The fact that for many years at Ma'o Farms, because the way we were structured as a not-for-profit that generated revenue.
Yeah, so it's a not-for-profit that generated revenue, and there's no denying that not only did you grow food, but you generated revenue and could sustain a program for young people. And ultimately, your success in that work led you to the position you're in now. Can you explain the program at Ma'o and how it worked, ultimately just summing it up?
The programmatic part was to recruit young adults from our community to run the daily operations of our organic farm. In exchange for the sweat equity, we provided them full tuition waiver to our university, the community college, and we asked for a 2-year commitment because we graduated them with their associates and moved them on to their baccalaureate. And that partnership with the university was intrinsic. It wasn't an add-on. It was a fundamental part of our relationship. And then through that space, we were able to create degree programs in the university system. And then I actually ended up becoming a lecturer.
Yeah, and I think that's what's unique about Ma'o is that you guys actually figured out a way to get people into college and go to college and come back and work for the community while at the same time growing food. And that's just like that's really cool. But now you're in the Office of Indigenous Research. What are the key features of this office, and what makes that office unique?
One of the key points of this office is that, A, we've been providing, basically it was an auxiliary staff for the university anyway. And B was an understanding that we're hitting the point at Ma'o where we are too big for local funders and no context for us for national funders.
Damn.
And also this idea of, I super don't romanticize activism, because I think it was something I was raised in. I carry incredible privilege in that I'm a child of activists and that, I've had a lot of time and a lot of work. And the type of activism of my father's generation was really done through this blue collar lens of like, we're not academics. We can't just hold signs to stop golf courses because the rest of the people in our community need those jobs. And we're going to look like assholes if we're just saying no development and not providing a counter proposal. Well, that's great for you. I'm super stoked you went to college and learned about your identity. But the rest of us, we got to get that job. No one paying us shit. Yeah. And like my father, them having to get those hard cracks early on to be like, well, how do we create our own jobs then?
Yeah. Yeah, I really like this, especially for me as a scholar, as somebody who also owns privilege in terms of, having access to certain financial livelihood where I'm not out there doing that blue collar work per se. So I'm really mindful now, especially at this point in my age where I'm being mindful of my type of activism and projects I want to start because I want people to live healthy lives. So that's what's unique about you and what you're having a conversation about is that there's multiple considerations we have to make. And, the necessity of this office and the necessity of this front you're working in terms of, still doing the work, but it may look a bit different than the frontline activism, but it's still there. And I really like how you're painting this picture and highlighting these considerations, especially like in terms of like the blue collar work that was taking place in the 60s, 70s. That your father was a part of and that, there's still fundamental food we need to get here and there's still fundamental necessities we need in life here to live. And your father did that. Like you highlighted that in a previous conversation we had where it wasn't just like resistance and saying no to something. It was providing the alternative also. So can you explain how your father and that group of activists in your genealogy went about doing that?
they brought back traditional fisher people to teach our people how to fish with this explicit intent of building on economic development.
Yeah, so not only recovering traditional fishing practices, but also it sounds like those practices had a very utilitarian value to provide for the people again. Did you have conversations at Ma'o about these land-based practices in terms of your nonprofit and how you're going to go about, or how you chose to go about trying to make them utilitarian and practical again? And I like what you're saying about not romanticizing not only activism, but even the traditional practices, right? Because the traditional practices did have that very fundamental value of providing for the masses and providing for the people. So how did these conversations around traditional practices show up at Ma'o?
We're seeing at Ma'o, we had the hard question of how do we normalize them? And how do we de-romanticize being on the periphery and talking about what we lost and using that narrative to mourn, and to others who aren't Hawaiian to mourn with us, to move towards, well, shit, your system's learnable. And our system is carrying, the more we intersect with your system, we understand our value proposition. Mm-hmm. Because it's super easy for us to start to talk in Hawaiian and do reporting to some of the grants that are coming down from these funders. Because they're talking about collective impacts, aggregating like file systems, manage all these things that like it's in our fucking DNA.
Yeah.
Things we always knew. And we started going to college and we're like, hey, you forced us to go to college. We're learning your stuff. It's like, you're talking about our stuff.
Yeah, and this is what's unique about your work and you is that you're flipping the script on them, especially in this era of like climate change and sustainability. You're saying, no, we knew this stuff. No, we know how to do this. And it's in, like you said, it's in our fucking DNA. Our ancestors did this. Like we fed the masses sustainably. And that's, that's so cool. Like in my mind, it just like makes sense. And for me, like what comes up for me is my undergraduate professor's work, Gerald Visner, when he wrote about survivance, when you're moving forward in a way where you're still autonomous and you're still determining your agency to make decisions and to thrive. And I guess this is also unique to Hawaii and the Kingdom of Hawaii at one time where well, I'll let you talk about it and I guess explain the history that you weren't always a dispossessed people and oppressed people. You were moving forward and in quotations, I guess, modernizing in a unique way. And I guess for our listeners, of course, you know, I'm really critical of capitalism and industry and economics in terms of how it's taking place here in North America around the extraction industries. But when we boil it down to basically a conversation around, again, in quotations, economic development, as Kamu's going to highlight, we have to have these conversations to figure out how to provide for our people. So yeah, I guess I'll let you answer that question. Is how does this conversation come forward based off your ancestors?
So I have to talk about my office through just the history of the grace our kupuna ancestors provided us. There was always this inclination in Hawaiian to bring stuff in. And I want to openly acknowledge that the Hawaiian experience of indigeneity is very different, and Western is very, very different than our cousins on the continent. Mm-hmm. Absolutely different. I super don't want to, this is my intersectionality. Like I'm Native Hawaiian. I am not of the tribes of you know, what you would call the continent in your own language in which you live now. And we didn't have the type of violence, and we didn't have the type of trauma that I'm learning about in Canada. Mm-hmm. So that's my mihi, and that's my apology if any of this comes off as flippant. And I think because of our own relationship with the colonizer, we lost our kingdom and we lost these things. But we didn't suffer the type of war and violence that many other indigenous people did. And I carry that weight of what our ancestors were allowed to learn, because we were in a different type. There was an absolute violence, but it was a different type of violence. It was a violence of disease. It was a violence of separation. But it also created a space for us to learn. We were able to have our kings and our royalty translate, our ancestral like chiefs translate into Western royalty. So we had Kalakaua and Kamehameha. All of our chiefs adopted contemporary structures early on. And, that was a really powerful part of how I understand them. Like how quickly Native Hawaiians adopted the printing press, how quickly Kamehameha, when quote unquote the Americans or like the British found Hawaiians, they didn't find a bunch of stragglers, found a bunch of fucking hammers, right? And they were like, looking at these guys like, what are you doing here? And they said, you have things we like about you, but touch our chief and find out what's going to happen. And they found out. So we ended up killing Cook. The part is that how quickly they adopted things, like there's stories of Kamehameha Nui lashing cannons to his canoes and taking British sailors into his family. And they're like, shit, we're rolling with you, man.
So British sailors choosing to link up with the Native Hawaiians and ultimately giving them advice.
Here's what you do. These guys have big ships. You got super fast canoes and a badass fucking standing army. Take some cannons, lash some cannons to the canoes, buy a couple galleons. You'll flank them, and they'll have a galleon to meet them. And they're going to be looking like, you're not going to take on the entire world. Mm-hmm. But when they look at you, they're going to be like, this is more trouble than it's worth. You guys can have this space. And they ended up waiting for Kamehameha to pass before they came in. Because how quickly he understood their system, because he was so solid in his. He didn't meet them from a form of grievance. He met them in strength because he was strong. And I've always loved that, and that was always the hard part of the activism I was raised in, because I was raised, working on the land. Mm-hmm. Then I went to college, and my bachelor's is in Hawaiian Studies, and my master's is in urban and regional planning, but I dropped out of high school. So my formative years was part doing cultural practice, and the other part was growing up. If you're from Hawaii, you'll know the fact what I say. I grew up a Waianae boy. Mm-hmm. And all my friends got into the meth trade, and all of that was really early on. So I had this really distinct, visceral awareness of poverty, and also a distinct awareness of traditional practice, because my father and his peers raised me doing traditional work. And the commonality between the two was power. It was understanding how do you get things done. And when I went to the university, it was a very different narrative, as much as I appreciated Hawaiian Studies, and my teachers were Halaniki Trask and the Kalakame Elehiva and all of those folks. We started doing activism, and I started learning a lot about the resistance. There was parts of it I really glommed onto, and there was parts of it I really had to think about hard. The parts that I glommed onto is all the things where I got the chance to learn with rigor about my ancestry. Because I had knew the practice of working the land, but because then I began to speak Hawaiian and study and be involved through the university and learning my cultural practices, I realized I now could learn the syntax to a language I was born speaking. And once I started learning the syntax of it, because I never spoke Hawaiian, my grandparents didn't learn it or anything. We just did Hawaiian work. Once I started learning the language and learning chants and all these things the university provided me, it was like my head broke open, because, wow, this didn't make sense this way. The part I always wrestled with was the idea of activism. I think activism aspires to agency. It aspires to being able to get decision-making back. But going from Hawaiian Studies to planning, then you begin to understand when you go into planning, man, if you're going to get your stuff back, you better be ready. You better be ready thinking about infrastructure. You better be ready about thinking what's your economic engine. You better be ready to think about what your governance model is that allows for dissent. Mm-hmm. You better be ready to think about, do you want to create an isolated kingdom and keep everyone out? Or do you want to integrate into systems around you? So I'd look back to our ancestors and see how they wrestled with that. And they did some really neat things. And therefore, where I'm at now in the Office of Indigenous Innovation, I think is a point of continuity. Because I sit in the research arm of the university, a lot of the things, the framework that we're presenting, for us, innovation is restoration. That our ancestral practices are really loaded. They don't say Hawaiian culture, for example, because that's the wrong words in English for choose to describe them. I say ancestral sciences and technologies of integrated biosystems management. Mm-hmm. with the science talking about a pedagogy and a way of teaching and a way of discerning. And technology is execution and putting forth of those sciences to do stuff. And to be really in the space, and we're talking here, is like, don't call Hawaiian culture. This is a science. And the distinction between our sciences and your sciences is I can talk to you about what our science is optimized for. I can talk about who is considered a scientist. I can talk to who owns the research. And I can talk to you how your science don't mean shit unless you can execute it, and how you look to the execution of your sciences through the technologies to see people in abundant. The ancestral sciences of this place was optimized for calibrating between natural and living systems. And the ways that you saw it work was that people were fit and the landscape was abundant. So it's so open-ended. I provided a little bit rambly on that, but I think an important component of it is, I'm not just in the research arm of the university, really trying to bring forward this idea of what does it mean to be in these spaces, positioning our ancestry as innovation, but making sure that the communities are at the table and co-designing what comes out of these things and owning the IP and being supported and executing it in their own terms so that they can reclaim the economic engines, they can reclaim our education systems. Mm-hmm. And we talk about our ancestry. We're no longer fighting for a place to be at the table, but being invited because people need us to help them solve the shit they created.
Yeah.
Like the systems that help us figure this out. Yeah. And I think that's a long-winded answer. Maybe that went no place near what you're at.
No, it makes sense. It's like you're talking about flipping the script, right? How this dynamic unfolded where they messed up the world and ultimately messed up our lands. And therefore, the ones who have the answers are us. Right. And that, like, I really like how you're painting this picture, like some solid words you stated that really clicked with me, where you said we need the infrastructure, like we need the governance system, we need the economic system, and we need to be able to do stuff and execute, the plans that we have. And that's where I'm at, like as a PhD candidate right now, working on my thesis. It's like, well, how does the governance system work? How does that economic system work? Like if you want land back, then like obviously in my territory in Saskatchewan, it's a agribusiness province. So for me, naturally, it's like, well, we're going to have to figure out a way to have a conversation about this economic system and find a way to feed ourselves too through land back, because land back's not just like an activist slogan. It literally requires a bigger macro conversation around infrastructure and how we're going to feed ourselves and what systems are we going to operate in, and where's our infrastructure? Like, where is it? And how do we move forward?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the thing that pisses me off, is I think about, and maybe I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone. And again, I don't romanticize activism because I was an activist for a long time.
Yeah, you were there as a little guy.
We got the scars to prove it, and we have the burnout and the drugs and all of the repressed anger and these things that come from it. Activism is a colonial legacy. We learned activism in the same way we learned other things, right? And then,
yeah. So like activism is basically all we could resort to do in some moments in time, but it's not all we are, right? Can you give some examples of what you mean?
So to give some tangible examples, and also the part I think is really important to note is like, I also don't romanticize our ancestors. Mm-hmm. I mean, I humanize. I mean, I when you romanticize your ancestors, then you don't provide a critical lens to your own past, and you don't love people you romanticize because you don't see them as people. You don't give them the grace to have made mistakes. You don't give yourself the license to address the mistakes you make in your life because the stakes are so high. And it is completely understandable to romanticize your ancestors, especially when these motherfuckers made us feel so shitty about ourselves for generations. Pardon my French. But I've learned that is like, when you don't have a healthy relationship with your past, it's a form of built-in trauma to romanticize your ancestry. You can love them with every ounce of your being.
really like how you're highlighting the difference between loving our ancestors, but not romanticizing the very specific conditions and behaviors as a result of those conditions. Like this element of humanizing them. It's really cool. It speaks to me, and that distinguishment is really important. So like I like this element of where you're highlighting the importance of not romanticizing them, but also choosing to love them, and then at the same time being mindful of our ancestors being the products of their environment. In order to live, we had to work together and function together communally as humans.
But you saw them as humans. What I do romanticize is our land. The land taught our ancestors first.
Yeah.
And like that, I was like, when's the last time you taught the mountain something or the ocean something? When we restore those types of relationships, we really understand the brilliance of our ancestors because they learned these things from the land. And like you move past to romanticization when you start doing the actual work, and then you get to a space of like admiring them. You're like, wow, I'm learning the same things as you did, Grandpa. Like I'm learning these things from you. Like these things were learnable.
Yeah. You really invoked a memory I have of my late father who always said and took time to mention that our culture is not lost and it's not being lost. It's out there on the land. And it's really cool for me to connect these dots in my brain as you're talking about this, because it's important to highlight that our culture stems from the land. It's not the other way around. Like I like how you said, when was the last time you taught a mountain something? So the landscape is literally the best teacher. And just recently, like a few months ago, when it got cold, we took our daughters camping and we were out there together. And I was literally thinking about fatherhood and in terms of how my ancestors most likely stood here on this landscape watching their kids play. And the landscape, for the most part here, the horizon line is the same. Like it hasn't changed drastically in thousands and thousands of years. So when we go out onto these landscapes and we see the horizon line, when we see, the very unique topography of the landscape, it's the same. And I just had this really interesting awareness that I wasn't the only person to ever do this in that location before, that there was others before me. But it wasn't like the relationship to my ancestors or people who've done it before me. It was the relationship and the observation I had of watching this land-based marker on the horizon and how it's always been there. And this is what sticks out for me is that it was the land. I guess what I'm trying to say is it was that space and landscape observing me. And it felt cool. It felt unique. And I like how you said, when was the last time you taught the mountain something? Or when was the last time you taught the land something? It doesn't work that way. The land teaches us. The land is our teacher in that regard, like how you're explaining it and highlighting it. And I really like that. And I feel like there's a real big cultural resurgence around identity and culture and looking the part, but not so much practicing the part. And I feel like culture has been compartmentalized to be really ethnographic or be really like explanatory in terms of this is all we need to do and concentrate on. And the land is absent in that. Like the experience and interaction with the changing landscape is absent in that. And part of that too in North America, I feel, is because we do have a big population that lives an urban existence. So the symbiotic relationship between culture and land may not necessarily be an option in some cases. And obviously, the history of North America being very bloody, very brutal. So there's very real reasons why we don't necessarily have a physical interaction with land. And it's interesting how a lot of people's work tends to compartmentalize culture to the point of where the land is not necessarily within the conversation, or they justify not being able to get out there, or they justify all this very physical expression of culture. But literally that came from our intimate relationship with the topography, with the landscape, with the land and territory that we're from. And this is why, like, I feel like a lot of our old people who are very aware know that the land and the land-based practice tied to those landscapes is more important than the cultural expression. So I'm connecting a lot of dots hearing you speak about this, and it's really cool to have this conversation with you. I feel, though, that some of the listeners or people out there in general will want to ask the question of, how do we not romanticize our ancestors? Because, yeah, you highlighted how it is like a result of trauma to want to romanticize them, because we don't necessarily have a relationship, or in some cases even lineage to them, in terms of not knowing what they knew, not speaking what they spoke. And so there's a tendency to want to romanticize. But the question for you then is how do we not romanticize our ancestors and view them as humans, and view them as ultimately humans who at times make mistakes and are also learning? Because I think that's more of like a common thread I have with my ancestors, now that you mention, is that I'm human and they were human. We're learning. They were learning. I'm a father. They were a father. So how do we not romanticize them?
Allow them the grace of having been humans and made mistakes too, and not bring everything with them. Allow yourself the grace to be a learner, but have the idea of what are your measures of accountability. And I think super important to this work is something we thought a lot about at Manoa, about this idea of indigenizing. To me, that's the continuity of decolonizing. My father, I don't know if I shared this with you guys, part of the zero boundaries he had, we were really like, okay, we had us as little kids demo one of our old workplace, and it's me and my brothers. It was okay, just break this stuff down. We learned really quickly about things like load-bearing beams.
Yeah.
You know, and then he also made us build our own home from the ground up because we were complaining. He did a bunch of stuff. I'm realizing when we, over the summers of when we were 12 to 18, I think he's one of the most brilliant dealing with puberty strategies. These kids are gonna have he had a bunch of boys, they're gonna have all these raging hormones, and I have them for the summer. Let's make them do some really hard physical labor. But I found that demoing a house, is hard. Building a house is something completely different.
Yeah.
And the thought that had to go between the orders and staging of building a house, of knowing the different components, knowing the difference between laying the cement to framing it, to putting in the electrical, to putting in the windows. And then right after we built our house, who had the biggest hurricane we ever saw in Iki. This was 92. And then after we had done building our house, but we were barely like just watching our house through the window, because it was an external house that we had built. And my dad's, well, we'll get a chance to see how good a job you did. But bringing that to the space of indigenizing, you can't just deconstruct things.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the challenges I think a lot about Indigenous, as an Indigenous academic, that if it's not tied to practice, there's a romanticizing of it. But if you're getting tenure, you better make damn sure that you're not blowing smoke up people's ass that don't have tenure, that aren't getting paid to say radical things, who are living day to day by what they are getting from the system. Or you're going to have a whole bunch of pissed off people coming after you when they realize they no longer have food. So this idea for me of indigenizing is to repurpose the structures that were thrust upon you to be vehicles for ancestral responsibilities. What we think about in this process is, what are the ancestral practices you want to bring with you? Understand your ancestry with rigor. If you have access to your practices, do them. Do the literature reviews, do them, get calices. But the first phase is then what is your aha moments by doing them in a contemporary society, and what it provides you like being able to be successful in a contemporary society. The second level of indigenization, we use this PICO framework, which is like I learned from one of our mentors. Like your PICO O is your fontanelle, it's your connection to your ancestors. Your PICO E is your navel, and that's the connection to the living, the O. And the PICO R is your reproductive organs, and that's your connection to the future. So the first level of analysis is your PICO O. Like, what are your ancestral systems? Be super explicit. Don't just say indigenous. Name it. And name the specific role it played in the broader systems around it. How was it measured? What was the practices and all of those different things? The second part of it was then how do you deploy these? How do you deploy these systems in contemporary society with the end goal of promoting executive decision making in your own community? So you can't just do we want to adopt this or that because it'll get us jobs. Like what is the moral compass and the principles and the measurements that guided your ancestor frameworks, the laws, the infractions around it, and how do you bring those two into a contemporary space to identify, okay, this is how we can deploy these systems and where we own, but allows us decision-making power, and not the kind through guilt, but decision-making power through people affording you what you've done in a contemporary. And then the PICO A, the last level of indigenization to me is the future. Is how is your accumulating of agency now providing future generations the platform for abundance, knowing that climate change is here, knowing that all of these things are there. An example for us is Ma'o. So the two things we tracked on a daily basis on the farm was sales and GPA, the sales of products and the GPAs of students. So we went from angry Hawaiians to job creators and degree designers. You didn't have to be Hawaiian to work at Ma'o, but what was super critical was we did the preliminary analysis first. In our ancestral systems, we were self-sufficient in valleys. At the end of the year, like in this time of the year, in the rainy season, the chief would come to each valley and the people of the valley would show how much food could be produced and how strong they were. And in a non-monetary economy, that's your year-end reporting to your chief where you got your contract renewed. And they could see the people then weren't serfs. They weren't commoners. They were experts. They were economists. Because for our chiefs, we didn't have the intermediary of money. We had mana, which was the ability to see productivity around you. We tracked those two correlatives those two measurements of fitness of people and abundance of landscapes into contemporary metrics. Fitness of people became GPAs and VMIs. Abundance of landscape became sales of product. And because Ma'o was created as a nonprofit that generated revenue, it allowed us to put structure on how we raised our money and how the money was executed and invested back, and the transparency that was inherent in being a nonprofit, that people could read our books and give us input on how we do it. It allowed us to, though, claim agency because we're hitting shit, man. If you're from an indigenous community and you're getting brown butts and seats in college, the university needs you. If you're from an indigenous community and you're feeding people outside of the community, they need you. If you're an indigenous community and you're informing their strategic sustainability frameworks, they need you. If you're creating college degrees that other people can go to, that allows them to understand the importance of your ancestry, their role in it, if they're not Hawaiian, but you're directing it, they need you, right? And I think that moving towards indigenization honors the fact that all of the people that were activists had to be activists, and they fought like hell. And they gave their lives to stop the violence as it was happening. But I think if we continue to be activists in Hawaii and not have that discernment, we always have to know how to fight. Never stop with that. But if you just lead with fighting all the time, I feel we dishonor those that fought so hard because it showed that we've gained nothing. All we still have is grievance. When in actuality, because they forced us to learn English and go to their college, such value proposition of our ancestry, like we can be doing so many things now, like we are doing so many things now that we can reposition ourselves, and set the future generations up to have the infrastructure, to have the economic engines and have those things where if we when we do reclaim agency, it'll be on our terms. So I think that is playing the long game.
Yeah, and I really like how you highlighted that you took your ancestral history and basically took the moral compass and applied it to the very specific conditions you're living in your territory. And I think there is value in that. Like I see the value in that and the uniqueness of that. And again, it's providing me a moral compass too. And that long game is really interesting for me too now, especially as a father. And the fact that we need infrastructure, and I'm not saying let's go all out and be like imitation white men or imitation capitalists, but let's have a very good concrete conversation about what's going on in our territory and what's our moral compass on how we navigate that and disrupt it. And again, build that house. Like how you talked about, it's a completely different process to build a house as opposed to deconstructing a house. And my friends, my bros that I grew up with, they have kids too, right? So it's like, how are we feeding our kids in a sustainable way? So it's not just like going out there and wanting to fight the settler farmer who's racist. It's I want to figure out a way to sustain my family through maybe some of your practices and our land-based relationship. And I want, like for me right now, where I'm at with my analysis is I want that economy because they're making millions off it and we're not. And we literally are like starving in our own homeland, and Canada's like selling all our grain. It's technically our grain. Same with the forest industry, right? So I'm not saying to go in and extract resources or go and be all like negative about it and clear cut forests or anything like that. No, what I want is agency to determine what we need, how we're going to get it, and ultimately do it sustainably. And I guess like this, like for me, like I see the need for an agrarian reform on the prairie. Like I really look up to like Thomas Sankara in terms of how he repurposed the land for the people ultimately.
Oh man. And I think I'm just, as I'm talking to, I'm realizing I'm bringing a lot of heat. I mean, if I'm saying things that sound sideways to people or disrespectful, that is not my intent. I carry a lot of privilege as a Native Hawaiian and as a college-educated one and as a cis male. So I have a lot of things to learn too. So my intention is to always be learning about what my accountability is to my words. But I'm also very like excited because, you know, as a parent too, one of the things that I feel really fucking drives me crazy is like people just subscribe to the fact that, oh, well, everything's horrible. And, you know, there's a German word for it, I always slaughter, but taking pleasure in one's own unhappiness. And then fuck that, right? So like where I am excited, I think, and where I see opportunities, we just were able to create in America's federal government, an Office of Indigenous Innovation and Health Equity. Mm-hmm. And this office was based out of time spent with some of our cousins from Osage Nation and Dr. Valerie Bluebird Jernigan and our cousins in Aotearoa, the Naitahu'iwi Maori tribe on South Island. Spent time at Ma'o, and we intentionally did a ritual to be like, well, what does it mean to learn from each other? Because they had asked us to, if they could replicate the model, and we're like, well, you can't replicate it per se, but we can spend time together, just a full immersive week learning from each other and see what fits. And the long and short of it, out of that, there was at the same time a report that came out of Ma'o by one of our native scholars and Kukui, the founder's nephew, Dr. Elika Maunakea, where they studied the gut biomes of our students at Ma'o. And they found that if you worked on Ma'o for a year, you're 60% less likely to develop type 2 diabetes. And you saved the state $15,000 per year. Wow. So we took that framework and we went, and when I moved to the Office of Research in the University of Hawaii, and we put in a proposal to reenact this type of research at scale, to do a landscape analysis of all Indigenous practitioners who want to begin to identify the elements of their work that could be considered a health intervention. With the understanding that when we restore our practices, we restore a context for health and well-being. So we got it. And basically what we'll be doing is a landscape analysis of traditional practitioners in partnership with the Department of Native Hawaiian Health and Indigenous researchers that will help provide opportunities for research to show the value of traditional practice in reflected in human biome. Mm-hmm. We're currently working on a project too with the same group of people, same community organizations, but with different researchers who are soil scientists, to show how traditional practices sequester carbon, as well as heal microbes. So this idea then of traditional practitioners and having native researchers doing the research, who have both the cultural competencies as well as the technical capacities to draw really clear, substantial data on carbon and health, which was, as they're saying, like those are two things we measured: how fit are the people, how abundant is the landscape. To have the university affirm that. And then the last part of it is we're creating hubs that have mixed use spaces of machine learning, like AI and machine learning, data visualization centers that we have access to build these centers out in our community and to have spaces where you can do these measurements, but they're also situated in our communities of practice to reposition Native Hawaiian practice as data science. To build a data science pathways that start in high schools that teaches the kids to still hunt and still fish. You're a data scientist. And then provide them the contemporary structures around it that would start in high school and terminate with a baccalaureate degree in data science. And what that will provide is, if you want a living wage job, being a data scientist is a pretty good way to do it. But if you call your ancestry data science first, that's what they were doing. Yeah. And you rooted in that practice, you're validated by the system. And your ancestry is elevated as data science. And you don't have to have the culture of inferiority anymore. Mm-hmm. And what we want to do with that is to replicate so much of our stories, like our me'e, our champions, like Moe, or Hiaka. They had tools. Moe, you probably saw Disney.
Moana, yeah.
And Manaya Kalani was Maui's technology. It was his hook by which he changed the atmospheres and spaces around him. And we understand those stories, not just of who we were, but who we were expected to be, to use contemporary technologies as a magnifier of our traditional practices so that we can be equipping Indigenous people to not just be doing performative things in public, but to be driving innovations that can help calibrate in global issues and equipping our youth to do it. And my hope is that in the same way you would learn Greek to understand physics, you would learn Latin to understand law, you would learn the indigenous language or whatever space you're in to understand sustainability. And that would afford practitioners the living wage jobs, the agency and executive directing decision-making and recalibrating what others fucked up. And I'll make this caveat. I'm a first world indigenous person, so my carbon footprint is probably bigger than anybody else who's actually in places. So I am not talking as a noble savage. I am absolutely complicit. So this is my responsibility as a first world, quote unquote, first world, even though it's an antiquated terminology. Like I participate in consumerism as much as anybody who's not Hawaiian. Yeah. I feed this beast as much as anybody else. So it's on me to be able to figure that out, to be completely self-aware and not to ascribe an other to the person that's fucking off the road. Is me. And what do I do to account for that? So that was a little bit of thinking about in your last questions, like, where do we want to go and what are some opportunities explicitly that I bring from Mao into this space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. It's like you're bridging it all, and that's what attracts me to your conversation and then how you're explaining things is it's simply beyond recovering the cultural practice. There's so much more to it. Like even how you said, don't call it culture, call it what it really is. It's a bigger system. It's a bigger knowledge system, and it's tied. And it's tied to everything, cosmology and the times we live in, and you breaking that down, it's really forcing my brain to think now too, because it's more than just learning how to hunt. It's more than just like for me, my project was archery. Like that's a quiver back there, right? One of our traditional bows. And for our listeners, we're on Zoom having a conversation, looking at each other, and I have on my wall my quiver hanging up on the wall. But I realized, like with you talking, like using that as an example, is that the archery and warrior culture is really romanticized, not only by Hollywood, but even by our own people. And that whole concept of the bow, like one of my mentors always said, the bow is not a weapon, it's a tool for livelihood. And that it wasn't until later where it started to be labeled and branded and used as a weapon, but it was first and foremost a tool that will provide food for people to come together and eat. So for your family, for your community, and ultimately even for diplomacy, because you would have to come together to eat and share a meal together and have conversations and mitigate issues. So I always thought of that in terms of how do we take those moral compasses and apply it to that practice today? And what's my philosophy as somebody who shoots bow and admires that tool? And you did the same. Like you took the ancestral teachings and history and applied it to the very specific conditions and found a way forward. I mean, to me, it would be like a survivance and continuance for sure. And that's what it sounds like you're doing. And you're explaining this in a way where I have never heard it before, on the level and the depth you're talking about it in terms of the positionality of who you are and where you come from under these very specific conditions. But again, there's a depth to what you're saying here, and it's resonating.
Really because of my upbringing. And I think that also for me, like I was raised with parents that I was already doing this. So I really carry so much weight around, like I didn't invent things. I was a product of people creating this space. I was a knucklehead. And people took the time to yell at me, and people took the time to kind of, because they saw something. And I will state like really quickly, the thing that is fundamental to all of this though is emotional intelligence. And this idea of like trauma-informed care. Like you can't skip through that part. And I think one of the biggest things I wrestle a lot with about my own ancestry, and something that I don't romanticize and I'm really curious about is like, I don't want to be in the space where the most violent make the rules. And that's why gender equity and understanding intersectionality, and like understanding when people, if you've been oppressed in one way, you should always understand and have compassion for others who have been oppressed and be willing to listen to their things. So much of what I hope to provide in my office, my intention is that the next person, I know I can take it because I'm not a small guy and I can speak well to people in English, and I'm cis and I'm like, 5'11" and 240.
Yeah. And you bring up an interesting point in terms of a lot of these systems are dominated by white males, are dominated by settlers and colonizers. And then obviously, like you highlight how you're a cis man. What are your thoughts on this?
I understand that, but my hope is that the person who takes this office next, either going to be a mahu or a woman. And like, how do I use my ability to be physical to create a defensible space for those who actually know what they're doing? Like they're not the most violent, but they just see things and they understand things and they're thoughtful, and they, the entry to this should be rigor. The entry point should be self-awareness. The entry point should be a willingness to be criticized, a willingness to learn. Not that I have the flashiest or neatest things, because then we just replicate this system that's not thoughtful, that's not responsive, that's not actually compassionate. And we romanticize the violent parts of our lives because it allows us to survive now, but sure as shit wasn't the fullness of who we were as a people, right? And I really want to emphasize that, like, all this stuff is really great, but if at its core, if it's not matriarchal, if it doesn't have this space for those who ascribe to be like gender fluid to feel comfortable, it's not worth shit. It isn't worth doing, because it just becomes a culture of violence. And I think that is something I really wrestle with a lot as a cis male who grew up in violence. Like, how do you not ascribe that to our identity? Ascribe like violence was a part of it. It was something we had to understand, but it wasn't who we were. We were generative people, and we valued healing because healing was practical, and healing created life. And we had rituals for death and for conflict, but it didn't subsume us. I want that to be crystal. If there's anything I close with, is what I think the end goal should be.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing. Yeah, you're definitely like influencing my brainwaves, because for me, like I said, it's important for me to think about the alternatives. Like if we're critiquing industry, then we have to be willing to find our people a way of life to sustain themselves. Like, you know what I mean? And that's where my brain's at. And then it kept coming up, like, I know Kamu's going to have some context for this. I know Kamu's going to have some context for this because he's doing something, and you're delivering results. And I think that's what I'm attracted to right now, is I want to see people who are delivering the result and creating change and actually collecting the data. And data collection is so pivotal, because like you making those references is just, it's there. Like the data's there, the results are there. And this is so much more than just like, grandstanding or looking cool for the camera. This is actual results here.
Everything Indigenous, I understand, was to be able to execute. And you were judged on what you could execute. Talkers had a very precarious position. Now we have the buffer of Costco's and all this other shit where you can talk and no one's going, well, I guess it sounds good. Back then, there was no artificial way to get, you couldn't like magically just get old. There was no built-in human obsolescence. Like you had to execute. And I think one of the inherent dangers I've seen in contemporary indigeneity is like the idea of education separate from employment. Like our scholars were in the fields. Scholars, like you can talk a lot, but you fucking better have a bunch of food behind your mouth, because otherwise you're gonna be like, you're taking up a lot of space.
Exactly.
These great ideas, but and I do not mean to denigrate the rigor of the academy. And I think it's super important that we do this, because I'm paid at the university. Shit, if I've been on a farm for 2 years now. But if you can't, because of the space that we're holding, point really directly to what we're allowing to grow, then we don't deserve to be employed. Yeah. Then we need to be regrounded again to learn it better, to come into these systems and try again. I do think this, to your point, there is no easy answer and there is no silver bullet. There is a dailiness to this, and everything is subject to entropy. Today's good idea is tomorrow's antiquated things. So what I will say is so important is ritual. Our rituals of accountability they weren't empty. They were how we commune with each other and how we assist our work and how we assist our landscape. And that the idea of indigeneity is really interesting. One of my mentors, Auntie Manu Meyer, talked like indigeneity is continuity. So you're indigenous to someplace. And if you're indigenous to a space, that means you're part of a lineal continuity that has thousands of years of research and development. They're highly in tune to that space. That will always be important to conversations. If you're not indigenous to that space, the way you show up, you support those who are indigenous. And the thing I loved about our ancestors, like Kamuela, how they ascribed allies, they're like, well, we're strong in our shit. You look strong in your shit. You want to join us? Shoots. Here's our family. This is the rules. We can work together, and versus they did these bad things to us. Can you help us? And I understand that that's really necessary for some people, some communities to actually have to ask. But at some point you should be like, this is where we're strong, because the people that will come in will be strong too. And we get to choose who allies with us. And we get to say, we like what you're doing. We want to learn from you. And I think is such, there is a hunger for indigeneity because the human experience for most of us pre-industrialization was indigenous. We have strong ties to land and places. So when we're aware of that, we're aware of our value. I think it allows us how we move forward into the future, defining it.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. And like what comes up for me in terms of your work and projects is like, your results, if we put that in a big pile of food, your pile would be huge. Like your project, like how you said you have to have food behind your mouth. Like the results are there. And that's why, I look forward to learning from you and having this relationship going on into the future, because
Absolutely, man.
it's badass to see. And you can't debate that. Like I like how you put some coals to the feet of academics, because a lot of them are fancy talkers. They talk really pretty out the mouth, but then when you look at their projects, there's not much there. Not to discount them, because I'm obviously in the academy, but we do, like you said, there's a quote you said where you need to get those calluses on your hand too, right? Because that's wisdom. Like the calluses and the time you put in is literally, you're learning in that process.
And all people deserve grace, right? And all people deserve an opportunity. And I super don't want to be an indictment. It's just like, maybe it's my own baggage too, but I'm far from perfect. And I really, more than anything else, will welcome critiques of these ideas, because it's how we welcome rigor.
Yeah, and like all through your conversation, you definitely had your little trigger warnings, but they're definitely coming from a place of like truth and experience, and it's causing me to think, and I know a lot of our listeners are going to think about what you're saying too. And if they wanted to know more about what you do or projects you're referring to, how do they see what Ma'o's doing or what you're doing?
Sure. No, and that's a really good question. You can put the Mao webpage up, and that was my genealogy of practice. I'll send over a link of different organizations that I was a part of. As far as the office, we're still brand new, and we're still trying to figure out who we are. They can get in contact with me via my email, just kenos@hawaii.edu. I can't guarantee I'll get to the red where like I'm up to my neck and stuff, but
yeah, you're a busy guy. I'm glad you made time for us though.
This is my accountability measure. I really, really, I'm accountable to the indigenous people of practice, and I think the other systems around me, I try to translate our strengths and try to negotiate what it looks like. But my actual accountability is the people of land, and that will always be true that was how my dad was accountable to. And so I really appreciate, I see this as my accountability to be authentic and vulnerable and honest about what I'm doing, and to be called out if welcoming being called out if there's ways that it feels that I'm co-opting things, or if I'm moving into dangerous territory. Because I'm really, and when you look at where I'm situated, I am in the Office of Research of Hawaiian University for the state of Hawaii.
Yeah. And you're, like you said, your reference to wayfinding, right? You're navigating it in real time. You're there, and you made time for us to talk about it. And now we gotta.
Stars are different, the birds different, the boat's the same.
Yeah. Are there any shout outs you want to give before we close off?
Yeah, so I really want to make clear that, my office now is the first opportunity I have to be explicitly having leadership over. Before that, I was able to do my work as a learner, and as a beneficiary of Kukui Mauna Kea and Gary Forth, husband and wife team that were the founders of Ma'o, that allowed me, after I graduated from college, to move back home to my community. And through their intentionality of Kukui being, of Oiwi, Kanaka, and her part of a family in Waianae that had put generations of work in as activists. Her grandmother, Catherine Mauna Kea, was one of the matriarchs of Waianae, one of those families that was early on as Kanaka. We're really serious about how we establish our economic stability as people. And she imparted that on her children and her grandchildren. And Kukui was such a holder of the Ike, and her husband, Gary, models allyship. He's Kiwi, he came up from Aotearoa and played rugby in Hawaii, but he, as a Pakeha, a non-Auli, really dove in with all the Kanaka and activism, and lent his voice and lent his strength to back Hawaiians in reclaiming their land. And when he met Kukui, he just jumped behind her and used his standing in Western society as a cis white, pretty big rugby playing male to get behind her and say, like, however I can back you and your people, I will. And he did it, not just through talk, but showing up every fucking day on the farm and doing everything he can and learning everything he was taught and imparting it to the youth of the community. So they were my mentors. So Ma'o was really their vision, and they allowed me to enter in their space. And also, like, before that, my father and all of his peers and the creation of Ka'ala Farms and these other spaces. If I know anything, it's because people took the time to invest in me and did the hard dailiness of adulting, of writing the grants and the reporting and the HR and all of those things so that I could learn. So all the projects, and especially the projects that you saw when you came to Ma'o, there were spaces that were built that I was able to help and collaborate with. But so much of the work is, when we talk about our work, it's always ours. There is no one single, we try to really create this idea that everyone is important, but no one's invaluable. That we work workers in a lineage. So continuity is our collective responsibility. I just so happen to been able to train, maybe even to articulate what we do in ways that make sense. But the visions I shared and the thinking was all done in co-design with so many people. So I super don't want to lay claim to any of the thinking and knowledge. Is something that that came from me as much as came about as being a part of things with many people, and many of them non-Hawaiian that were living in Hawaii and chose to be with Hawaiians and chose to to back us, and in exchange we backed them. So I think, and we had this cross sharing of information. So that was just a big thing. I just wanted to make sure that so much of the things that I've been lucky enough to be a part of was because of others that have done it before me and took the time to explain it to me, especially often when I didn't deserve it. And they were patient with me in that space. So that's why when I say grace and when I say people provided grace, I don't necessarily mean it from a Christian perspective. I mean it like in the literal sense of like, they could have not, because I wasn't behaving often in ways that warranted them taking the time to teach me, but they did anyway. And that's really important that I wanted to share.
Awesome. Well, thanks for making time. I really appreciate everything you said and the time you gave us.
I really appreciate being here, man. And I appreciate being asked, and I appreciate any feedback people can provide.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and you gave us lots to think about. I think everybody was thinking about your episode and what you have to share from your experience. And it speaks to me right now at this point where I'm at in my fatherhood, in my organizing, and in terms of what I want to build in terms of infrastructure and activism is important. Like I'd be out there in a heartbeat if people showed up to my doorstep. I also want to think about building something that could sustain me, my family, and my people, and ultimately the masses. And that's why it's so great to see the food that you've grown, or the food that these projects you're invested in have grown, and what they've given people. Like that speaks to me on multiple levels.
I really appreciate that you appreciate the work that we're doing. And I wanted to be really clear that these ideas are always created in collectives and with each other. So that, there are a lot of people that are really, I carry a lot of traditions. And I guess the part I find is really interesting too, is like the reason why this is so unique in some ways is because Hawaiians have had a different colonial experience. And we have, it's really impinged upon me to be clear on the intersectionality, because indigeneity is a construct, and that we cannot use it as a catch-all, because within that taxonomy, there is so much divergence of experiences and realities. So indigenous people have to practice intersectionality and the awareness of intersectionality in the space. And the grace that was provided, like my family, was that from early on, we had enough breathing room to ask questions about economic development back in the 70s and 80s through the lens of our practices. So we just had a longer runway. But it doesn't mean that we're any better, like advanced. And if other communities had the same type of bandwidth that we were afforded, I'm pretty sure they would have come up with the same frameworks out of necessity. So I really want to make sure that, we really appreciate the work being done by all Indigenous communities in reclaiming their practices. And we want to honor our ancestors' ability to be really deft at figuring some things out to provide license for other communities to do the same.
Yeah. I really like how you said that. Like, I really like how you highlighted that there's uniqueness to our lands. Therefore, there's uniqueness to the projects that emerge from those lands. And we can't cut and paste as much as people like to try. And I think you really fostered that in your inquiry and conversation you had with us today. I like it. I really like everything you said. And again, it's getting my gears turning. It's allowing me to think about a sector or an area that I normally don't think about, just in terms of broadening, broadening my resistance to actually creating infrastructure and maintaining our presence through, other projects, not just activism and not just, pointing the finger at the colonizer, but actually doing the work to build systems.
Yeah, it's really important. And I think there's a lot of safety to be held in the narrative of being vanquished, because it's really easy to ostracize those that did it to you. You have every reason in the world to. But eventually, there's a sense of atrophy will set in, and you don't use the muscles of like being generative. That's really hard. So yeah, I see that that's what you're trying to do, and that's probably thankless. And sometimes ostracizing work.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. And that's partly why, I wanted to find like-minded people or people who are doing something practical to get on the podcast and share their ideas and views about the work going on in their territory and on their landscape, and taking into account very specific parameters that exist for them. And you did all that. You really shared a lot of good information, and I really appreciate talking to you. And again, the time you made for us I'm grateful for that.
Stay in contact too, and just let me know. I welcome the future conversations too. On what, if things percolate, and maybe at some point I'd like to introduce you to some of my peers too.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be great. It'd be great to talk story with other people, and we're definitely open to it. And yeah, thanks again.
But I really appreciate being here, man, and I'm super down to continue the conversation anyways. It makes sense for you, brother.
For sure. All right, we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Okay. Aloha.